The dust of Normandy in July 1944 tasted like chalk and unburied death. It coated the back of your throat and stung your eyes, a constant reminder that the liberation of Europe had stalled in the bloody hedgerows of France. For the men of the 1st Canadian Army, the initial euphoria of D-Day had long since evaporated, replaced by a grinding, attritional nightmare that felt more like the trench warfare of the First World War than the lightning-fast maneuver warfare they had trained for. They were digging in, fighting for every yard, every farmhouse, and every ruined crossroads against an enemy that simply refused to break. And facing them, dug into the high ground that dominated the battlefield south of Caen, was a formation that would become the stuff of nightmares for the Allied soldier. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend. To the casual observer, or perhaps to a Canadian reinforcement just arriving from the staging areas in England, the enemy across the line might have seemed like a bad joke. They were teenagers, children, really. The 12th SS was unique in the German war machine, formed almost entirely from members of the Hitler Youth born in 1926. Most of the soldiers facing the Canadians were barely 18 years old. Many were 17. They were fueled by a decade of indoctrination, raised on a diet of ideological fanaticism, and told that they were the biological elite of the world. They had been weaned on the belief that dying for the fatherland was the highest glory a young man could achieve. When Allied intelligence first got wind of a division made up of teenagers, there were cracks made in the mess halls. There were jokes about milk battalions and how the Canadians would have to spank them and send them home to their mothers. It was easy to mock them from a distance. It was easy to laugh at the idea of fighting schoolboys. But nobody who had met them in battle was laughing anymore. The laughter had died in the first week of the invasion. These weren't just children. They were fanatical warriors led by hard-bitten veterans from the Eastern Front, officers who had learned the trade of slaughter in the vast, freezing expanses of Russia. They fought with a savagery that shocked even the most seasoned Allied commanders. They didn't surrender. They didn't retreat. When they ran out of ammunition, they fought with shovels and bayonets. And, as the Canadians had already learned to their horror at the Ardennes Abbey, the 12th SS did not play by the rules of war. They executed prisoners. They murdered the wounded. They were a lethal combination of youthful aggression and sociopathic discipline, equipped with the best tanks in the German arsenal, the terrifying Panthers and the invincible Tigers. By late July, the 12th SS sat atop Verrières Ridge, a kidney-shaped spur of high ground that loomed over the Canadian positions. From this vantage point, the teenage soldiers of the SS looked down on the Tommies, their dismissal of the Canadians, and felt a supreme sense of arrogance. They watched the Canadian convoys moving in the valley below like ants. They adjusted their artillery coordinates with calm precision. They mocked the Canadian attempts to probe their lines. To the young grenadiers of the Hitlerjugend, the Canadians were amateurs, a colonial rabble sent to die by a British Empire that was already crumbling. They believed their own propaganda, that the Aryan will was superior to the material wealth of the decadent West. They sat in their dugouts, cleaning their MG-42s, waiting for the next wave of attacks, confident that they could bleed the Canadian Army white on the slopes of that ridge. They had turned the terrain into a killing zone, a fortress of buried tanks, hidden anti-tank guns, and interlocking fields of fire that no army could penetrate. They dared the Canadians to try, and the Canadians were about to oblige. The unit chosen to break the back of the SS position on the ridge was the Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment of Canada. This was not just any infantry battalion. The Black Watch was the oldest Highland Regiment in Canada, a unit steeped in tradition and history, raised in Montreal and carrying the pride of a nation on its shoulders. They were the Ladies from Hell, a nickname earned by their Scottish predecessors in the trenches of the Great War, and they wore the red hackle on their bonnets with a fierce defiance. They were volunteers, men who had left the factories, the farms, and the offices of Quebec and beyond to fight tyranny. They were tough, they were disciplined, and they were tired of the stalemate. But nothing in their training could have prepared them for what awaited them on the slopes of Verrières Ridge. The operation was codenamed Spring. It was a plan born of desperation and necessity. The Allied breakout was stalling, and the British commander, Bernard Montgomery, needed to pin down the German armor on the eastern flank to allow the Americans to break out in the west. The Canadians were the anvil upon which the German hammer was supposed to smash itself. But for the men on the ground, grand strategy meant nothing. For the men of the Black Watch, Operation Spring meant one thing: a frontal assault in broad daylight, up a gradual slope completely devoid of cover, directly into the teeth of the finest Panzer Division in the Wehrmacht. It was a suicide mission, though no one called it that in the briefing room. The plan relied on timing, on artillery, and on the support of tanks that were supposed to be there, but, as the fog of war descended, would be tragically absent. The night before the attack, the air in the Canadian assembly areas was heavy with a tension that was almost physical. The men cleaned their Lee Enfield rifles for the 10th time. They sharpened bayonets. They wrote letters home that they hoped wouldn't be their last, tucking them into kit bags to be collected by the company clerks. The veterans, the men who had survived the landing and the battles for Caen, looked at the new replacements with a mixture of pity and hardness. They knew what going up against the SS meant. They knew that the Hitler Youth didn't shoot to wound. The rumors of the murders of Canadian POWs had circulated through the ranks, turning fear into a cold, burning hatred. This wasn't just a battle for territory anymore. It was a grudge match. The Black Watch wasn't just going to take a hill. They were going to settle a score. As the sun began to rise on July 25, 1944, the battlefield was deceptively quiet. The massive artillery barrage that was supposed to crush the German defenses and keep the SS heads down had been fired, but due to a catastrophic breakdown in timing and communication, it had been fired too early. The creeping barrage, the wall of exploding steel that infantrymen were trained to walk behind for protection, had moved on, rolling over the ridge and leaving the German positions largely intact. The dust from the shelling hung in the air, a gray shroud that obscured the terrified faces of the men waiting for the whistle. Major Phil Griffin, the commanding officer of the Black Watch for this operation, looked at his watch. The tanks that were supposed to support them, the Shermans of the 6th Canadian Armored Regiment, were nowhere to be seen. They had been delayed, bottled up in the traffic jams of the narrow Normandy lanes, or knocked out by long-range fire. Griffin had a choice: wait for the tanks and lose the element of surprise, or attack now, as ordered, across the open ground with nothing but rifles, Bren guns, and the shirts on their backs. He looked at his men. They were ready, or as ready as men could be to walk into hell. The order came down the line: fix bayonets. The metallic click of steel locking onto lugs rippled through the wheat fields. Then, the whistle blew. Advance! 300 men of the Black Watch rose from the cornfields of the valley floor. To their front lay the ridge, a long sloping rise covered in wheat and root crops, culminating in the village of Fontenay-le-Marmion and the fortified crest. It looked peaceful. The wind rippled through the tall grain. For the first few hundred yards, there was silence. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a predator watching its prey step into the trap. The Canadians moved forward in extended line, boots crunching on the dry earth, eyes scanning the horizon where the dark shapes of the hedgerows concealed the enemy. They were exposed, naked. Every step took them further away from safety and deeper into the kill zone that the SS commanders had meticulously designed. Up on the ridge, the teenage gunners of the 12th SS watched through the slits of their bunkers and the periscopes of their buried Panther tanks. They couldn't believe their luck. The Canadians were walking towards them in broad daylight, without armor support. It was a target practice scenario. The German commanders held their fire, displaying that terrifying discipline that separated them from common soldiers. They waited. They let the Black Watch come closer. 500 yards, 400 yards. They waited until they could see the sweat on the Canadians' faces, until they could distinguish the officers from the men. They waited until there was no possibility of escape. Then, the world ended. The ridge erupted. It wasn't just machine gun fire. It was a wall of lead. The distinctive ripsaw sound of the MG-42s, firing 200 rounds per minute, tore through the air, interlocking their streams of fire to create a scythe that cut down the wheat and the men standing in it. Mortar rounds began to fall with terrifying accuracy, the moaning minis shrieking down and blasting craters into the soft earth, tossing bodies into the air like rag dolls. But the worst was the tank fire. The 12th SS had dug their tanks in, turning them into pillboxes that were virtually invisible until they fired. High-velocity 75mm shells slammed into the Canadian lines, turning men into mist. The Black Watch didn't break. In the face of this inferno, they did the impossible. They kept moving forward. Men dropped by the dozens, but the survivors closed the gaps and pressed on. "Keep moving! Keep moving!" the sergeants screamed, their voices barely audible over the roar of the battle. They fired their Bren guns from the hip, spraying bullets at the invisible enemy in the hedgerows, desperate to keep the German heads down. But the SS heads weren't down. They were firing with the calm, robotic precision of men who knew they held all the cards. As the Canadians pushed further up the slope, they entered the killing box. The German fire was coming from the front, but now heavily camouflaged machine gun nests on the flanks opened up. They were being hit from 3 sides. The tall wheat that had concealed their advance now became a trap. Wounded men lay hidden in the stalks, unable to be seen by the medics, bleeding out into the French soil while the battle raged over them. The communication lines were cut almost instantly. The radios were smashed or the operators killed. Major Griffin tried to rally his men, leading by example, moving from platoon to platoon, but the command structure was disintegrating under the sheer weight of fire. It was a massacre, but it was also a display of heroism that defied logic. A chaotic melee erupted as small groups of Black Watch soldiers actually made it to the crest of the ridge. They had walked through fire and reached the German positions. There, the battle became personal. It wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about survival and rage. Canadians jumped into slit trenches, swinging rifle butts and stabbing with bayonets, engaging the SS in brutal hand-to-hand combat. For a brief, shining moment, the amateurs had breached the fortress. They had looked the supermen in the eye and found them mortal. But bravery alone cannot stop a tank. As the remnants of the Black Watch crested the ridge, the 12th SS played their ace. The camouflaged Panthers reversed out of their dugouts and counterattacked. The heavy German armor rolled over the Canadian foxholes, crushing men and equipment. The SS infantry, supported by half-tracks, swarmed the isolated pockets of Canadian resistance. The mockery that the title of this story alludes to was at its peak here. The SS commanders radioed their headquarters, reporting that they were mopping up the Canadian rabble. They looted the bodies of the fallen, taking cigarettes and souvenirs, laughing at the foolishness of an army that would send men to die against steel without protection. They thought they had broken the spirit of the Canadian Army. They thought that after a slaughter like this, the Canadians would lose their stomach for the fight. By the time the sun began to set, the Black Watch had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 300 men who had gone up that hill, only 15 would answer the roll call that evening. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. The ridge remained in German hands. The 12th SS celebrated their victory. They had repelled the invasion. They had proven their superiority. They mocked the disorganized Canadians and toasted to the invincibility of the Reich. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that the battle ended when the shooting stopped. They assumed that the Canadians would retreat, lick their wounds, and play it safe. They didn't understand the nature of the enemy they had just angered. The sacrifice of the Black Watch hadn't been in vain. Their suicidal charge had identified the location of every German gun emplacement, every tank pit, and every bunker. They had forced the SS to reveal their hand. And while the Black Watch had paid the price in blood, the rest of the Canadian Corps was watching, and a cold, hard resolve was settling over the army. The mockery of the SS was about to be answered not with words, but with a fury that would shake the very foundations of Normandy. The Hitler Youth had poked the bear. They had laughed at the Canadians, but the Canadians weren't done. The trap was about to swing shut, and the laughter on Verrières Ridge was about to be silenced forever. The silence that fell over the Canadian lines in the days following the disaster at Verrières Ridge was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a workshop before the hammers begin to fall. The massacre of the Black Watch had rippled through the entire 1st Canadian Army, from the staff officers in their command tents to the mechanics greasing the tracks of the Shermans in the rear. The grief was there, certainly, but it had hardened into something cold and jagged. The soldiers had seen what the 12th SS was capable of. They had seen the arrogance of the Hitler Youth, the way they flaunted their invincibility, the way they had turned the wheat fields into a slaughterhouse. The time for probing attacks was over. The time for playing by the old rules of infantry warfare was finished. If the Germans wanted a war of annihilation, the Canadians were about to give them one. The architect of this retribution was Lieutenant-General Guy Simonds, the commander of the 2 Canadian Corps. Simonds was not a man given to sentimentality. He was a cold, calculating tactician who looked at the failure of Operation Spring not as a tragedy, but as a data point. He understood exactly why the Black Watch had died. They were soft targets moving slowly across open ground against dug-in heavy weapons. The German defensive doctrine relied on the Allies being predictable. They expected another artillery barrage, followed by men walking in lines. They expected to be able to pop up from their holes, mow down the infantry, and then retreat to the next line of defense. Simonds decided he would never give them that target again. He looked at the American Priest self-propelled guns, artillery pieces mounted on tank chassis, and ordered the guns removed. In their place, he packed infantry. It was a radical, unheard-of modification. These Kangaroos, as they were christened, were the world's first dedicated armored personnel carriers. The infantry wouldn't walk into the fire anymore. They would drive through it, encased in steel, right up to the enemy trenches. On the night of August 7th, 1944, the Canadians launched Operation Totalize. But this time, the sun didn't rise to reveal walking targets. This time, the attack came in the dead of night. Simonds ordered searchlights to be bounced off the low cloud cover, creating a ghostly, artificial moonlight that illuminated the German silhouettes while blinding their optics. The 12th SS sentries, peering into the darkness, didn't see lines of men. They heard a low geological rumble that shook the ground beneath their boots. It was the sound of 600 tanks and APCs moving in 4 massive columns, a solid phalanx of armor, advancing 4 tanks wide. The Canadians had dispensed with the gentlemanly tactics. They were driving a steel battering ram straight down the Falaise road. The teenage soldiers of the Hitlerjugend, who had laughed at the exposed Black Watch just weeks earlier, now found themselves in a nightmare. They fired their MG-42s, but the bullets simply sparked harmlessly off the hulls of the advancing Kangaroos. They called for artillery, but the Canadian columns were moving too fast, bypassing strong points, ignoring the flanks, and driving deep into the German rear. The amateurs had changed the game. For the first time since D-Day, the 12th SS was confused. Panic, a foreign emotion to these indoctrinated zealots, began to seep into their communications. The Milk Battalion was being overrun by a mechanical monster they couldn't stop. As dawn broke, the Allied air power arrived. This wasn't just a few stray fighters. It was the full might of the U.S. 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command. The ground shook as thousands of tons of high explosives pulverized the German positions. The Tigers and Panthers, the vaunted cats of the SS that had reigned supreme on the ridge, were flipped over like toys. The arrogant commanders who had stood tall on Verrières Ridge were now cowering in the dirt, their ears bleeding from the concussion of the bombs, realizing that the sky itself had turned against them. The Canadians pushed forward, the Polish armored division on their wing, driving south with a relentless fury. They weren't stopping to take prisoners. They were driving to close the trap. The objective was Falaise. The German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army were collapsing. They were trying to retreat east, to escape the encircling Allied forces. The Americans were pushing up from the south, the British from the west, and the Canadians were the cork in the bottle, driving down from the north to seal the exit. The gap between the armies was narrowing by the hour. What had been a 20-mile wide escape route was shrinking to 10, then 5, then 2. And flowing through this narrow choke point was the wreckage of the German army in Normandy. It was here, in the chaos of the Falaise Pocket, that the 12th SS met its reckoning. The division that had mocked the Canadians was now tasked with holding the northern jaw of the trap open. They fought with the desperation of rats in a sinking ship. But the Canadians were no longer the hesitant force of July. The 4th Canadian Armored Division and the 3rd Infantry Division slammed into the retreating German columns. The tables had turned completely. Now it was the Germans who were exposed in the open, clogging the roads with horse-drawn carts, stolen French cars, and broken tanks. Now it was the Canadians who held the high ground. The corridor of death, as it became known, was a scene of biblical destruction. Canadian artillery observers, perched on the hills overlooking the Dives River, looked down at the traffic jam of the retreating Wehrmacht. They didn't even need to aim. They just called for fire for effect on the coordinates of the road. The shells rained down on the stalled convoys. Then came the typhoons. The RAF fighter bombers swooped down like hawks, firing rockets into the mass of men and machines. The carnage was absolute. The smell of burning rubber, roasting flesh, and rotting horses drifted miles downwind. The 12th SS, trying to maintain discipline amidst the rout, found themselves being hunted down by the very men they had dismissed. The climax of this vengeance came at a tiny village called St. Lambert-sur-Dives. This was the final exit, the last bridge out of hell for the Germans. And blocking it was a small force of Canadians led by Major David Currie of the South Alberta Regiment. Currie had only a handful of tanks and a few hundred men, but he parked his force right across the German escape route. For 3 days, the remnants of the elite German units, including the 12th SS, threw themselves at Currie's position. They attacked in waves, desperate to break through, but the Canadians didn't budge. Major Currie was everywhere. He was on foot directing tank fire. He was tossing grenades. He was manning a machine gun. When the German officers, arrogant to the end, demanded he surrender because he was outnumbered, Currie simply replied with a volley of fire. The Germans realized too late that these were the same colonials they had laughed at. But now the Canadians had the tanks, the guns, and the grit. The 12th SS threw their remaining Panthers at the village, but the Canadian Shermans, waiting in ambush positions, put rounds through their flanks. The invincible German armor burned in the streets of St. Lambert, just like the Canadian tanks had burned on Verrières Ridge. But this time, there was no counterattack. There was only death. By the time the battle for the village ended, Currie's tiny force had killed or captured over 2,000 Germans and destroyed 7 tanks. The plug was in the bottle. The gap was closed. Inside the pocket, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend ceased to exist as a fighting formation. The division that had started the campaign with 20,000 men and 150 tanks was reduced to a few hundred scarecrows wandering the woods without weapons. The teenage supermen, stripped of their tanks and their officers, were finally broken. Canadian patrols moving through the corridor of death to mop up survivors found a landscape that defied description. Vehicles were piled 3 high, bulldozer blades having been used to clear paths through the wreckage. Amidst the twisted metal lay the bodies of the Hitler Youth. They didn't look like the master race anymore. They looked like what they were: children who had been lied to, led to the slaughter by a regime that didn't care about them, and destroyed by an army of free men who had learned the hard way how to fight. One Canadian sergeant, a survivor of the Black Watch massacre, recounted walking past a group of SS prisoners sitting in a field, waiting to be trucked to the rear. A few weeks ago, these same boys might have sneered at him or spit on the ground. Now, they sat with their heads in their hands, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes hollow and vacant. There was no mockery left. There was no laughter. When the Canadian sergeant walked by, some of the young Germans flinched, expecting the same brutality they had dished out at the Ardennes Abbey. But the Canadian didn't shoot. He didn't strike them. He simply looked at them with a mixture of disgust and pity, lit a cigarette, and kept walking. That was the ultimate victory. The Canadians hadn't just beaten the SS, they had destroyed their entire worldview without losing their own humanity. The Battle of Normandy ended not with a German triumph, but with the total destruction of the German 7th Army. The road to Paris, and eventually to Berlin, was open. The Black Watch had been avenged, not just by the killing of the enemy, but by the complete dismantling of the unit that had tormented them. The 12th SS had mocked the Canadian advance, believing that fanaticism could defeat democracy. They learned in the fires of the Falaise Gap that when the polite Canadians finally decide to take the gloves off, they don't stop hitting until the job is done. The laughter on Verrières Ridge was a distant memory, drowned out by the roar of Canadian Sherman engines heading east towards the Rhine, leaving the broken pride of the Hitler Youth rusting in the French mud behind them.